The year was 1977, and a science-adjacent space opera was in the cinemas, and people loved it. It featured spaceships, laser guns, magical forces, and every story beat of the classical hero's journey, with the young protagonist being drawn into conflict and eventually fighting the evil forces. This movie is of course called Star Wars, and it has nothing to do with this video. Instead, we're talking about something known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a military program that the US Missile Defense Agency worked on during the 80s. The stated goal was to create weapons that can protect the United States from nuclear war. It was of course nicknamed the Star Wars program. There was a second goal, and that was to restart the Cold War era arms race between the USSR and the USA. The story goes that the USSR could not afford this arms race, and this caused the collapse of the USSR 7 years later. Because of this, some conservatives will tell you that Reagan won the Cold War, even though he was out of office when the Soviet bloc fell. Is this correct? Was it really the Star Wars program that made the USSR dissolve? Well, it's complicated, that's why the video is so long. We will discuss the Cold War, the purpose of the Star Wars program, the things the USSR faced while Reagan talked about his missile shield, and eventually I'll answer whether Reagan really bankrupted the USSR and won the Cold War for America. If that sounds interesting to you and you want to hear more, then stick with me while I thank my sponsor. My sponsor is you! By watching my video, leaving comments, likes and donations, you make it possible for me to make videos full time, which enables me to make one video every week. So thank you to everyone who supports me in any way you can. My Patreons are the only reason I wasn't forced to get sponsorships. Thank you. Also, patrons get access to the Discord, you know? Our story, like many, starts in the Cold War. Famously, the USA and friends who loved capitalism and free markets, and the USSR and friends who really loved state socialism, had a bit of a disagreement over the future of all mankind. It was about the better way to organize and run society. For this, these countries would fund and arm movements all around the world to promote their ideology and way of life. While there were many wars like in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan and half of Africa, the two superpowers never went to war. And that's down to a major player in the story I'm telling here: nuclear weapons. As you know, in 1945, the Second World War in the Pacific ended after Japan was hit with 2 nuclear bombs. Whether those nuclear bombings were justified is sadly a contentious topic. They were not. Japan was on the brink already, and those nukes mostly killed civilians. As you know, only 3 years later the Soviet Union surprised the world by building and testing their own nuclear weapon way faster than anyone in the capitalist West assumed they could do it. This was because of the help of spies that worked right in the American nuclear weapons development program. True heroes of socialism. The threat of nuclear war now existed, but initially people were not that terrified of it. The US had assembled many nuclear weapons between 1945 and the Soviet tests in 1948. So for a few years at the start of the Cold War, America had a so-called bomb gap, which means there was a large difference between the nuclear capability of the two countries. Back then, the way to get a nuclear bomb to the enemy was a plane. There was nothing else that could carry those things that far. And this likewise made people not respect nuclear weapons. You see, bombers that carry nukes are large and slow. So if you install plenty of radar stations like NORAD, you can see the bombers coming hours ahead of the time. And then you can use anti-aircraft cannons or small maneuverable fighter planes to shoot down those bombers. So for a long time, both sides invested huge amounts of money into their bomber fleets and fighter planes. Because bombers can only be built so fast, there was a worry of a bomber gap in the Soviet favor, meaning the Soviets could attack more targets, increasing the likelihood that some bombers would get through. If you watch Dr. Strangelove, which is a movie from the 50s, you see that the entire nuclear attack there is based on planes, which was accurate at the time. This is why there were public fallout shelters. The idea was that there would be many hours of warning before a nuclear attack, so everyone could get to the bunker in time. This changed. During World War II, Germany had a problem, and that was that their bombers kept being shot down by the Royal Air Force. So they greenlit a program to create a way to deliver bombs without them being able to be shot down. This ended in the V-2, a missile that was able to fly from France to London, flying so fast and with such a parabola that it was unable to be shot down. And after the war, both the US and USSR used the research of this time to build up their own missiles. These missiles would be so fast and fly so high that nothing could stop them once they were in the air. So, with time, vulnerable bombers were not the main force of nuclear war anymore. They were slow and could be shot down. Missiles would now rule the Cold War. Naturally, there were arguments about a missile gap at this point. And this is when a famous situation arose. MAD, mutually assured destruction. Since missiles cannot be shot down, a country was powerless against them. Once they were in the air, it was over. So both sides developed a policy of shooting back. If enemy ICBMs were identified, they would fire back with everything they have. And that was made public. So both sides knew that launching a nuclear attack would end in the destruction of both of them. Ironically, this constant threat of nuclear war cooled down the Cold War. Before that, many thought they could nuke the USSR and just shoot down their bombers. Now, with missiles, everyone knew that a nuclear war was not winnable. MAD is a great name for this position because it is entirely mad. One missile fired by a rogue team or one of 1,000 radar dishes malfunctioning, a Norwegian sounding rocket, all of that could cause a nuclear response and eradicate society as we know it. And that happened a lot. There are many stories of the US or USSR almost launching nuclear weapons because they thought the others fired first. Nuclear submarines that can fire from anywhere and hit targets in 5 minutes did not make the situation more stable. So, many people hated MAD and searched other solutions. This includes Ronald Reagan, an actor turned president who I don't like. I have many reasons, his pro-war rhetoric and escalation of the Cold War only being one of them. He's also the one who changed the dominant American ideology from conservative Keynesianism to neoliberalism. If you are a normal person and wondering what the hell that means, I made a whole video on the different types of liberal capitalists. In short, neoliberalism is by far worse than what came before it. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a communist. Anyways, because Reagan did not like MAD, he started searching for ways around it. And the only way to do that is to somehow disable the threat coming from Soviet ICBMs. So he proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed the Star Wars program. The goals of the plan were very vague and not thought out well at all. The idea was to create a sort of protective shield around the United States. You see, an ICBM has 3 phases it goes through. First, the boost phase, where it gets up to speed, many times the speed of sound. In the second phase, it's in space where there's no air resistance, so it just keeps going at the same speed and direction as before. And then it re-enters the atmosphere in an almost vertical angle to get to the target. MAD was based on avoiding the first phase. Don't do anything that causes them to be launched. Reagan's Star Wars program was intended to stop the missiles while they were cruising through space towards the United States. For this, they wanted to use lasers, neutrons, conventional explosive or other nukes. The idea was that if a nuke went off next to an ICBM, that ICBM would be destroyed and not reach its goal. The secondary goal of Reagan was to restart the strategic arms race. He knew that by the 80s the Soviet Union was not doing well. They had trouble financing things and were losing many soldiers in Afghanistan. Reagan thought and said that restarting the arms race would bankrupt the Soviet Union and win the Cold War. To keep a long story short, Reagan spent $50 billion on testing his laser defense systems, but ultimately it was concluded that every single idea Reagan had for a missile defense system was either impossible or 50 years in the future. The program was put on ice once Clinton became president. So yes, they failed to provide a nuke shield for the United States, but did they at least bankrupt the USSR? We know that the USSR collapsed soon after Reagan's presidency ended, and I think it's time to look at what the USSR was doing during the story I told about the US. The USSR was busy stagnating. Their GDP did not grow, and much more importantly, people's lives were no longer improving. Why was this? Well, there are many factors, but I think the most significant one lies with the Soviet leadership. You see, by the 70s, the party had become very content with the situation. They did no longer dream of a socialist world republic that leads the world in living standards. Instead, they kept going, business as usual, everything as it was, which was a good deal for the party leadership because they already had better lives than the average person. In short, the Soviet leadership had become content and decadent, leading to general economic trouble for the state. So eventually, when Brezhnev and his two successors died, the party was willing to try their luck with a new young man with radical ideas, Gorbachev. All of the things that happened under Gorbachev already have their own video, so I will not go into too much detail here. But basically, he started introducing market features into the economy. He allowed companies to trade and sell things for profit to other companies and individuals after they fulfilled their quotas. He also cut spending of the state by basically stopping aid. So you see, in the USSR, if a company employed 100 people and made no profit, the state would step in and subsidize that company. The logic was that it's better to keep a non-efficient business running than to allow 100 people to be unemployed. The USSR did not demand that every business is profitable. That's a capitalist idea. In the USSR, having 0% unemployment was the main goal, not profit. Until Gorbachev came and ended that program, immediately spiking unemployment and ironically increasing state spending, because now those people were on unemployment benefits. Basically, Gorbachev tried to reform the USSR out of stagnation and mostly made things worse. There are many more examples, but we're moving on for the sake of time. You can see that the USSR was in trouble, so Reagan's plan to bankrupt the USSR made some sense. But I ask yet again, did it work? Well, if the Star Wars program was actually responsible for the USSR to bankrupt itself, then we should see that in military spending, since it was supposedly restarting the arms race. And if we look at Soviet military spending as percent of GDP, we see something very interesting. The USSR did actually spend more on its military in this period than compared to the USA. But curiously, that high spending started before Reagan and the Star Wars project. So why was that? Well, the USSR was at war, the Soviet-Afghan War. Basically, Afghanistan had a socialist revolution and immediately fell into a civil war, so the socialist faction asked the USSR to support them. Then the leader, who was Brezhnev, decided that a land invasion of Afghanistan was a great idea, so he sent in 600,000 soldiers and enough tanks to pull off Tiananmen Square times 200. The war was an awful idea. Afghanistan has many mountains with caves, and that is where the Mujahideen were fighting and preparing ambushes from. And when the Soviets came with their tanks, they shot them down with American weapons. Yes, this was the Cold War. The US sponsored the enemy of the USSR. Interestingly, if you watch the movie Rambo 3, which takes place in Afghanistan with the Russians as bad guys, you will see this credit at the end. This movie is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan. Which is funny because, of course, eventually the USSR left Afghanistan and the US invaded, and now the Mujahideen are the bad guys, so they changed the credits in the re-releases. Fun fact, every country that attempted to conquer Afghanistan in the land invasion failed. From Alexander the Great to the US military, nobody could do it. It's like invading Russia in winter. In the end, the Soviet-Afghan War would kill about 1 million people combined and not achieve anything besides costing the USSR a lot of money. But this would be later, we're still in the mid-80s. In the middle of Gorbachev reforming everything about the Soviet economy and slowly destroying it top-down, there was an event. In 1986, the residents of the Atomgrad named Pripyat were awoken by a huge explosion. It was the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant, commonly known as Chernobyl. This was a huge disaster for everyone. Because of the problems with bureaucracy we talked about before, the reaction of the state was slow. Millions were exposed to heightened radiation levels. Huge parades for May Day took place, even in Kiev, which was exposed to way higher than normal radiation. What followed was a huge effort to take care of this thing. The reactor core was not only open and emitting enough radiation to 100% kill someone within under a second of exposure, it was also on fire, spewing radioactive dust into the atmosphere, contaminating huge swaths of land. The whole thing was a humanitarian and PR disaster for the USSR. And once the fire was out and they had built a containment building, they needed to clean up. The area was still dangerously radioactive, so they had to bury the topsoil under itself, kill animals, cut down all trees, and way more. To do this, they employed 600,000 so-called liquidators. These were men who were taken out of their normal jobs in which they took part in economic activity and to deal with this issue. This was tremendously expensive for the USSR, and it had a significantly greater impact on the collapse of the USSR than the Star Wars program could have ever caused. In total, the Chernobyl cleanup made up just over 10% of the Soviet GDP. The military spending did not increase by 1% because of Reagan's wannabe arms race. If anything bankrupted the USSR, it was Chernobyl. Star Wars did not bankrupt the USSR, and Reagan played no part in the collapse of the USSR. He did not end the Cold War and deserves no credit. If anyone deserves credit for collapsing the USSR, it was Gorbachev and the party leadership. Actually, the collapse of the USSR was never a financial issue at all. It was a social issue. So, as I mentioned, the reforms Gorbachev brought spiked unemployment, which was not great for the people. Then inflation took hold, and suddenly people couldn't buy food anymore. The images of this period are still shown to everyone to show how communism equals no food. But really, the food issue in the 80s only came about after Gorbachev had tried to introduce market features. But it is true, looking at empty shelves like this proves the failure of communism. Oh, wait, why is that image in full HD? They did not have that tech in the 80s. Oh, it's an image of an Austrian store from literally a week ago. I guess using that logic, capitalism just failed or something. Or maybe economics is more complicated than showing a single image of a select place. But yes, the Soviet people were miserable. And then Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, which basically allowed the media to do whatever, and it made all the actions of the party public knowledge. They even opened the state archives, which were classified until then. This openness allowed the media to be sensationalists, so they were, talking about how horrible the party was and, more importantly, talking about how the different member states of the USSR should split up into many nations and ending the union of states that had achieved so much. Eventually, the member states declared themselves independent from the USSR and it ceased to exist by December of 1991. The successor states all established capitalism, which caused the life expectancies to drop so much that I heard some people compare it to genocide. I think that's a bit sensationalist, but you do you. If you want to hear the entire story of the collapse of the USSR, I have a video on it. This one was very oversimplified because I decided to dedicate 5 minutes to talking about the nuclear arms race and how ICBMs work. So, yeah, in conclusion, the USSR failed because of a corrupt, decadent leadership, incompetent reforms by Gorbachev, the Soviet-Afghan War, Chernobyl, and nationalism gripping the member states. Frankly, the USA had nothing to do with it, and Reagan and his Star Wars program made no difference to the process that ended the Soviet Union. So from now on, if you hear someone say that Reagan ended the Cold War, send them this video. At this point, I would wrap up the video and say thank you for watching, but I left a note in this section 3 days ago and it just said, "Socialism will be back." I have no idea what I meant by this. Maybe I wanted to write a paragraph about how the collapse of the USSR doesn't mean that socialism is over, but that seems so obvious. I genuinely don't know what past me meant by that when she wrote it. But anyways, thank you all for watching. Make sure to support me by hitting like, subscribe, or possibly even donating. Remember the €5 donation gets you into the Discord. And if you have a €10 donation, I will read out your name like this. Special thanks to Autumn Keasley, Theon Hartley, Alan Vo, Eric Betts, V, Xander Corbus, Tusnek, Attila Nemetz, Carissa, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Cusanelli, whose name I've been reading wrong for a year now, Emily Margot Klassen, Evie Wren, Herdina, Ian Snyder, Kevin Sanders, Klastrup, Lazy Panda 234, Liam S. Nane Pema, Raymond DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Sarah, Sean Murphy, Stemaster Chef, Theon Gillian Jr. and Trey.